Hey everyone, welcome to part 3 of The Way to Wealth by Benjamin Franklin. If you've seen the last two parts, you already know this book is full of timeless advice on success, money, and discipline. In this part, we go even deeper into the mindset that separates the truly successful from the ordinary. So if you're serious about building lasting success, this part is for you. Let's begin.
Chapter 4. On Nature's Method of Communicating Knowledge to the Young. By the principle of reiteration. We have, in a former chapter, endeavored to describe that particular act of the mind which generally follows simple perception, and by which an idea, when presented to it, is made the subject of active thought, or is reiterated again to itself. We have found upon good evidence that it is by this process, whether simple or complex, that the powers of the mind are cultivated, and we now proceed to shew that it is by the same act, and by it alone, that any portion of knowledge is ever communicated. 3. No truth or idea of any kind can make an effective entrance into the mind or can find a permanent lodgment in the memory so as to become knowledge until it has successfully undergone this process. There are two ways by which we usually acquire knowledge. The one is by observation, without the use of language, and which is common to us with those who are born deaf and dumb. And the other is through the medium of words, either heard or read. In both cases, however, the knowledge retained consists entirely of the several ideas which the objects or the words convey. And what we are now to shew is that these ideas thus conveyed can neither be received by the mind nor retained by the memory till they have undergone this process of reiteration. Page 57. While, on the contrary, it will be seen that, whenever this process really takes place, the idea thus reiterated does become part of our knowledge, and is, according to circumstances, more or less permanently fixed upon the memory. We shall for this purpose endeavor to trace the operation of the principle, both in the case of ideas communicated by objects without language, and in those conveyed to the mind by means of words.
That this act of reiteration of an idea by the mind must take place before objects of perception can become part of our knowledge, will, we think, be obvious from a consideration of the following facts. When, for example, we are in a crowded room or in the fields, numerous sounds enter the ear, thousands of images enter into and impress the eye, yet not one of these becomes part of our knowledge till it is thought of. That is, till the idea suggested by the sensation has not only been perceived, but reiterated by the mind. This will appear to many so plain that any farther illustration of the fact may be deemed useless. But experience has shown that the illustration of this important process in education is not only expedient, but is really necessary, as the overlooking of this simple principle has often been the cause of great inconsistencies on the part of teachers. We shall therefore endeavor to exhibit the working of the principle in various forms, that it may be fully appreciated when we come to apply it. Let us then suppose two children taken silently through a museum of curiosities, the one active and lively, the other dull and listless. It would be found on retiring that the former would be able to give an account of many things which he saw, and that the other would remember little or nothing. In this case, all the objects in the exhibition were seen by both, and the question arises, why does the knowledge of the one so much exceed that of the other? The reason is that the mind of the one was active, page 58, while the mind of the other was in a great measure inactive. Both saw the objects, but only one looked at them. The one actively employed his mind, fixed his eye on an object and thought of it. That is, he reiterated the ideas it suggested to him, whether as to form or color or movement, and by doing so, the ideas thus reiterated were effectively received and given over to the keeping of the memory. The other child saw the whole. They were perhaps objects of perception, but he allowed his sensations to die away as they were received, and his mind was left to wander, or to remain under the dreamy influence of a mere passive and evanescent train of thought. His attention was not arrested. His mind was not actively engaged on any of the articles he saw. In other words, the ideas which they suggested were not reiterated. For, now that it was the want of this mental reiteration which was the cause, and the only cause why this very usual means of acquiring knowledge failed to communicate it, may be proved, we think, by a very simple experiment. For if we shall suppose that the child who was obtaining no knowledge by means of the various curiosities around him had been asked at the time a question respecting any of them, a stuffed dog, for example, his attention would have been arrested, and his mind would have been roused to active thought. The words, "What is that?" from his teacher or companion would have made him look at it and reiterate the ideas of its form and color so far as to enable him to give an answer. And if he does so, it will be found afterwards, on leaving the place, that although he might have remained unconscious of the presence of all the other objects in the museum, he will remember the stuffed dog, merely because, by the question, the idea it suggested was taken up and reiterated by the mind. Page 59. While the sensations caused by all the rest were allowed to pass away, there is another circumstance of daily occurrence, which adds to the evidence that it is this principle which we have called reiteration, which forms the chief, if not the only avenue, by which ideas find access to the mind. And it is this, that when at any time we bring to recollection some former circumstance of life, however remote, or when we recall any part of our former knowledge, or the reason of this, we may remark once for all, is that what the mind reiterates it remembers, but nothing more. If during the hearing it reiterates the ideas, it will then remember the ideas. But if it reiterates the words without the ideas, it will remember nothing but words. Those therefore who sow words in the minds of the young, hoping afterwards to reap ideas, are as inconsistent as those who seek to gather grapes of thorns or figs of thistles. 5. Knowledge is received by the use of words in two ways, either by oral speech or by written language. But in both cases, the reception of the ideas is still governed by reiteration. We shall endeavor to examine the operation in both cases. Let us suppose that a teacher announces to a class of young children that Cain killed his brother Abel, and then examines the state of each child's mind in regard to it. All of them heard the words, but some only perhaps are now in possession of the truth communicated. Those who are so followed the teacher in his announcement, not so much in reiterating the words as in reiterating the idea, the truth itself, and therefore it is that they are now acquainted with the fact. Of those who heard, but have failed to add this truth to their stock of knowledge, there may be two classes: those who attended to what was said but failed to interpret the words, and those whose attention was not excited at all. Page 61. Those who failed to interpret the words, or to extract the idea from them, reiterated the words to themselves, and would perhaps be able to repeat the words again, but they do so in the same manner that a person reads or repeats words in an unknown tongue. The idea, the truth, is not yet perceived, and therefore cannot be remembered. The others who remember nothing have reiterated nothing. Their minds remained inactive. They also heard the words, but they failed to listen to them, in the same way as they often see objects but do not look at them. Here it is evident that every child who reiterated the idea in his own mind is in possession of the fact communicated, and all who did not do so, even although they reiterated the words, have no addition made to their knowledge, which shews that it is only by this act of the reiteration of the ideas that any portion of our knowledge is ever acquired. That this is a correct exhibition of the principle, and a legitimate inference from the phenomena, may be still farther proved by an experiment similar to one formerly recommended. Let the teacher, in the middle of a story, ask some of the inattentive pupils a question respecting some of the persons or things he is speaking about, and force the reiteration of that part of the narrative in the child's mind by getting an answer, and it will be found at the close that although he may remember nothing else of all that he heard, yet he will most perfectly remember that part about which he was questioned, and respecting which he returned an answer. The same thing may be ascertained by our own experience, in hearing a lecture or sermon, or even in conversation with a friend. In these cases, as long as our attention is kept up, that is, as long as we continue to reiterate the ideas that we hear, we may remember them. But when our minds flag or wander, in other words, when we cease to reiterate the ideas of the speaker, the sounds enter our ear, but page 62, the matter is gone. All that has been said during that period of inattention has been lost. It never has formed, and never can form, part of our knowledge. Thus we see that in the act of hearing oral communications, the principle of reiteration of the ideas is obviously necessary for the acquiring. This is a principle, then, of which the educationist should take advantage. For if nature invariably communicates knowledge by inducing her pupils to exercise their own minds on the subject taught, it is plain that the teacher should follow the same plan. His pupils cannot remain mentally inactive, and yet learn. Neither can the mere routine of verbal exercises either cultivate the mind or increase knowledge. These are but the husks of education, which may tantalize and weaken, but which can never satisfy the cravings of the young mind for information. Their mental food must be of a perfectly different kind, consisting of ideas and not of words, and these ideas they must receive and concoct by the active use of their own powers. The teacher must no doubt select the food for his pupils, and prepare it for their reception, by breaking it down into morsels, suited to their capacities. But this is all. They must eat and digest it for themselves. The pupil must think over in his own mind, and for himself all that he is either to know or remember. The ideas read or heard must be reiterated by himself, thought over again, if he is ever to profit by them. Without this, no care or pains on the part of the teacher, no exertion on the part of the pupil, will be of any avail. All the knowledge that he seems to acquire in any other way is repudiated by nature, and however plausible the exercise may appear, it will ultimately be found fruitless and vain. It is also worthy of remark that the tenacity with which the memory keeps hold of any idea or truth depends greatly upon the vigor of the mind at the time, and still more perhaps upon the frequency of its reiteration. If a child, however languid, is forced to this act of reiteration of an idea but once, it will be remembered for a longer or a shorter time. But if his mind be vigorous and lively, and more especially if he can be made repeatedly to reiterate the same idea in his mind at intervals, he will on that account retain it much more tenaciously, and will have it at the command of the will more readily. Hence the vividness with which the scenes and the circumstances of youth arise upon the mind, and the tenacity with which the memory holds them. These scenes were of daily occurrence, and the small number of remarkable circumstances connected with childhood and youth having few rivals to compete with them in attracting the attention, were witnessed frequently with all the vigor and liveliness of the youthful mind, as yet unburdened with care. They were of course frequently subjected to observation, and as frequently reiterated by the mind, and have on these accounts ever since been vividly pictured by the imagination, and continue familiar to the memory. It also accounts for another circumstance of common occurrence. For when, even in early infancy, any event happened which made a deeper impression upon the mind than usual, that simple circumstance will generally outlive all its neighbors, and will take precedence in point of distinct recollection to the close of life. The reason of this is not only the deep impression it made upon the mind at the moment, but principally because it had so strongly excited the feelings, that it was oftener thought of then and afterwards. In other words, this act of page 65 reiteration occurred more frequently with respect to it than the others, and therefore it is now better remembered. This is a principle, then, of which the educationist should take advantage. For if nature invariably communicates knowledge by inducing her pupils to exercise their own minds on the subject taught, it is plain that the teacher should follow the same plan. His pupils cannot remain mentally inactive, and yet learn. Neither can the mere routine of verbal exercises either cultivate the mind or increase knowledge. These are but the husks of education, which may tantalize and weaken, but which can never satisfy the cravings of the young mind for information. Their mental food must be of a perfectly different kind, consisting of ideas and not of words, and these ideas they must receive and concoct by the active use of their own powers. The teacher must no doubt select the food for his pupils, and prepare it for their reception, by breaking it down into morsels, suited to their capacities. But this is all. They must eat and digest it for themselves. The pupil must think over in his own mind, and for himself all that he is either to know or remember. The ideas read or heard must be reiterated by himself, thought over again, if he is ever to profit by them. Without this, no care or pains on the part of the teacher, no exertion on the part of the pupil, will be of any avail. All the knowledge that he seems to acquire in any other way is repudiated by nature, and however plausible the exercise may appear, it will ultimately be found fruitless and vain.
Hup. They.
On the acquisition of knowledge by the principle of individuation. Nature, as we have seen, has rendered it imperative that the act of reiteration should be performed page 66 upon every idea before it can have an entrance into the mind or be retained by the memory. But as the individual cannot reiterate or think over all the ideas suggested to him by the innumerable objects of sensation with which he is surrounded, it next becomes a matter of importance to ascertain the means employed by nature for enabling her pupils to receive and retain the greatest number of ideas, so that they shall ever afterwards remain at the command of the will. This she accomplishes by the operation of the three other principles to which we have adverted, namely, individuation, or abstraction, grouping, or association, and classification, or analysis. We shall in this chapter attend to the principle of individuation, and endeavor to trace its nature and uses in the acquisition of knowledge by the young. The first thing in an infant that will be remarked by a close observer of nature is, that while adding to its knowledge by observation, it always confines its attention to one thing at a time, till it has examined it. Before the period when this principle becomes conspicuous in an infant, the eye and the other senses are in a great measure inactive so far as the mind is concerned, and the first indication of the senses really ministering to the mind is the eye choosing an object, and the infant examining that object by itself, without allowing its attention to be distracted by anything else. This operation takes place as soon as an infant is capable of observation. It fixes its eye upon an object, generally one that is new to it, and it continues to look upon it till it has collected all the information that this object can give, or which the limited capacity of the infant will enable it to receive. Hence, with stationary objects this information is soon acquired, but with movable objects or toys, or things which are capable of varying, or multiplying the ideas received by the child, the look is more intense, and page 67, the attention is sustained without fatigue for a longer time. Till this information has been received, the child continues to look on, and if the object be removed, the eye still follows it with interest, and gives it up at last with reluctance. That by this concentration of its mind upon one object, the infant is adding to its knowledge, appears evident from the fact that objects which have already communicated their stock of information, and have become familiar, are less heeded than those that are new or uncommon. Every new thing excites the curiosity of the child, who is not content till that curiosity be gratified. This has been called the love of novelty. But it is not the love of novelty in the very questionable sense in which many understand that term. On the contrary, it is obviously a wise provision of nature, suited to the capacity and circumstances of children, which is to be taken advantage of, for conveying such crumbs and morsels of knowledge as their limited powers are able to receive, and which should never be abused, by presenting to them an unceasing whirl of names and objects, a process which fatigues the mind and leaves them without any specific information. It is the same principle, and is to be considered in the same light, as that which induces the philosopher to confine himself to the investigation of one phenomenon till he understands it. The information which the child is capable of receiving from each of the impressions then made is no doubt small, but it is still information, knowledge. This is what he is seeking, and at this stage of his progress it is only acquired by the concentration of the powers of the mind upon one thing at a time. The effect of this principle in the infant is worthy of remark. While the pupil remains under the teaching of nature, there is no confusion, no hurry, no failure. The tasks which she prescribes for him are never oppressive, and are constantly performed with ease and with pleasure. Although there be no page 68 selection made by the parent or teacher for the child to exercise his faculties upon, yet he instinctively selects for himself without hesitation and without mistake. All the objects in a room or in a landscape are before him, yet he is never oppressed by their number, nor bewildered by their variety. His mind is always at ease. He chooses for himself, but he never selects more for his special observation at one time than he can conveniently attend to. When the objects are new, his attention is restricted to one till it be known, and then, but not till then, as we shall immediately see, he is able and delights to employ himself in grouping it with others. In early infancy this attention to one object is protracted and slow, till he gradually acquires sufficient energy of mind by practice. Everyone must have observed how slowly the eye of an infant of 2 or 3 months old moves after an object, in comparison with one of 10. But even in the latter case, when the glance is lively and rapid, the same principle of individuation continues to operate. The information from an unknown object must still be received alone, and without distraction, although by that time the child is capable of receiving it more quickly. He is not now satisfied with viewing an object on one side, but he must view it on all sides. He endeavors by various means to acquire every one of the ideas which it is capable of communicating. His new toy is viewed with delight and wonder, and his eye by exercise can now scan in a moment its different parts. But this is not enough. He has now learned to make use of his other senses, and he employs them also for the purpose of becoming better acquainted with the object which he is contemplating. His toy is seized, mouthed, handled, turned, looked at on all sides, till all the information it can communicate has been received. And then only is it cast aside for something else, which is in its turn to add to his stock of knowledge. The circumstance to which we would especially call page 69 attention at present is the singleness of thought exercised upon the object during the time that the child is amused by it. He attends to nothing else, and he will look at nothing else, and were his attention forced from it for a moment, this is evidently done unwillingly, and, when allowed, it immediately returns to the object. It is also worthy of notice that if, while he is so engaged, we attempt to teach him something else, or in other words, to induce him to divide his attention upon some other new object, the distraction of his mind is at once apparent. We perceive that it is unnatural, and we find by experience that he does not profit by either. Now, from these indications it must be evident that any interference with this principle of individuation in teaching anything for the first time must always be hurtful. On the contrary, by attending to the principle and acting upon it in the training of the young, it must be productive of the happiest effects. While acted upon under the guidance of nature, its efficiency and power are astonishing. It is by means of this principle that the infant mind, with all its imbecility and want of development, acquires and retains more real knowledge in the course of a few months than is sometimes received at school afterwards during as many years. Few things are more cheering in prospect than the knowledge of this fact. For what may we not expect from the man, when his education while a child shall have been improved, and approximated to that of nature? The operation of the principle of individuation is not confined to the infant, but continues to maintain its place during all the after stages of life, whenever anything new and uncommon is presented as an object of knowledge. Everything is new to the infant, and therefore this principle is more conspicuous during the early stages of education. But it is still equally necessary for the child or the youth in similar circumstances, and nature compels him, as it were, still, page 70, to concentrate the powers of his mind upon every new object, till he has received and become familiar with the information it is calculated to furnish. Every one must have observed the intensity with which a child examines an object which he has never seen before, and the anxiety which he evinces to know all about it. It requires a considerable effort on his own part, and still greater on the part of others, to detach his mind from the object, till it has surrendered the full amount of information which the young inquirer is seeking. The boy with his new drum will attend to nothing else if he can help it, as long as he has anything to learn concerning it, and the noises it is capable of producing. And even when he has tired himself with beating it, he is not satisfied till he has explored its contents, to find out the cause which has created the sounds. The girl with her doll, in the same way, will voluntarily think of nothing else, as long as it can provide her with mental exercise. That is, as long as it can add something new to her present stock of knowledge. And it is here worthy of remark that the apparent exception in this case, arising from the greater length of time that a doll and a few other similar toys will amuse a child, is in reality a striking confirmation and illustration of the principle of which we are speaking. Such toys amuse longer because it is longer before the variety of which they are capable is exhausted. The doll is fondled and scolded and cradled and dressed and undressed in so many different ways that the craving for new ideas continues for a long period to be amply gratified. But the effect would be quite different were the very same doll placed where it could only be looked at. Every new movement with the toy is employed by nature for the cultivation of the mental powers, by reiterating the ideas thus imparted, and on which the imagination delights to dwell, and also in receiving a knowledge of individual objects and ideas, which, when once known, are to form the elements of page 71 future groupings, and of an endless variety of information. It is here of importance to recollect that almost all the information received by children is of a sensible kind. They can form little or no idea of abstract truths. The mind and the memory must be stored with sensible objects, first individually and then by grouping, before the child can arrive at a capacity for abstraction. Nature's first object, therefore, is to store the memory and imagination of the young with the names and images of things, which, as we have seen, are acquired individually, and, when once known, are remembered for future use. But those things which they have not yet seen or felt or heard or tasted are totally beyond their conception, and cannot be of any service, either in grouping or classification. Hence the great importance of allowing the young mind to act freely in acquiring new ideas by this principle of individuation. as without this all the lessons into which such ideas shall afterward be introduced must be in a great measure lost. Even adults can form no idea of an unknown object, except by compounding it of something that they already know. And this is at least equally the case with children, who, till they can group and compare objects which they have seen, can realize no idea of anything, however simple, that has not previously been subjected to the senses. Hence, therefore, the importance at this period of a child's education, of confining the attention chiefly to sensible objects, and of not confounding his faculties by too early an introduction of abstract ideas. Here then we have been able to detect the method by which nature selects and enables her pupils to prepare the materials of which their future knowledge is to be compounded. These materials are the ideas of sensible objects, and their properties and uses, which must be gathered and stored one by one. By inducing them to attempt to seize even two at a time, they will most probably lose both, and their powers, page 72, of collecting and storing will, by the same attempt, be injured and weakened. It is by means of this principle of individuation that, with the most intense craving for information, and while placed among innumerable objects calculated to gratify it, the infant and the child remain perfectly collected, without the slightest appearance of distraction of mind or confusion of ideas. With his thirst of knowledge ardent and constant, it enables him with the greatest delight to add hourly to his stores of knowledge, without difficulty, without irritation, and without fatigue. The application of these truths to the business of education we shall attend to in its proper place. In the meantime we may remark of how much importance it is that all knowledge communicated to the young be simple, and that for some time it consists chiefly of sensible objects and their qualities. Objects which they either know or can have access to. Abstract subjects are not suited for children, till they can group and classify, and compare the sensible objects with which they are already acquainted. The aim of the teacher, therefore, ought to be strictly to follow nature in this early stage of her operations, and to furnish food for his pupils of the proper kind and in proper proportions, keeping the thinking powers constantly in healthful exercise by giving as many ideas as the mind can reiterate, ideas which they suggest.
Shop. 6.
On the application of knowledge by the principle of association or grouping. Another principle which exhibits itself in the acquisition of knowledge by nature's pupils is that, page 73, of grouping, or associating objects together, after they are individually known. A child, or even an infant who is frightened or alarmed or who suffers any severe injury, remembers the several circumstances and has the place, the persons, and the things connected with the event all associated together and grouped into one scene or picture on the memory. These objects may have been numerous, but by the operation of this principle, they have all been apprehended and united so powerfully with each other that no future effort of the child can either separate or obliterate any portion of them, and so comprehensive that the recollection of any one of the circumstances instantly recalls all the others. These groupings in the mind of a child, formed chiefly by means of the imagination, are almost wholly compounded of sensible objects, and the only necessary prerequisite for their formation appears to be a knowledge of the individual elements of which they are to be composed. If an unknown object be presented to the mind in connection with the others that are known, it is generally excluded, and the things previously known retained. For example, in the case supposed above of an accident occurring to a child, there would be thousands of objects present and all cognizable by the senses, but not one of all these that were unknown, that is, that had not previously undergone the process of individuation, is found to form part of the remembered group. There is another circumstance connected with the operation of this principle in the young, which is of importance. Almost the whole of a child's knowledge is composed of these groupings. Before the development of the reasoning powers, by which the individual is enabled to classify the elements of his knowledge, there is no way of remembering these elements in connection with each other, except by this principle. If, therefore, we change the order or relative position of the elements or objects which, page 74, compose the scene or group, we draw the attention of the pupil altogether from the former, and create another which is entirely new, in the same way as the transposition of the figures in any sum forms another of an entirely different amount. The drawing room, for example, is seen by the children of the family with the fireplace, the cabinet, the sofas, the tables, and other stationary ornaments in certain relative positions, and this grouping of those objects is to them in reality all that they know of the room. Any material change in shifting these objects to other places in the apartment would, to the parent whose judgment is ripened, produce feelings comparatively slight, But to the younger branches of the family who group but cannot as yet classify, it would appear like the complete annihilation of the former apartment. The different arrangement of a few of the articles only would to them create another, and an entirely different room. This leads us to observe another circumstance connected with the operation of this principle, in the instruction of the young, which is the remarkable fact that, by making the child familiar with a very few primitive elements, a parent or teacher may communicate an almost infinite variety of groupings or stories for cultivating the mind and increasing the knowledge of his pupil. Hence it is that hundreds of agreeable and useful little histories have been composed for children, with no other machinery than a mamma and her child, and the occasional introduction of a doll or a dog, a cat or a canary bird. To the child, there is in these numerous groupings no appearance of sameness, nor want of variety, and although so much circumscribed in their original elements, they never fail to amuse and delight. The most important circumstance, however, connected with the working of this principle in the education of the young, appears to be the necessity of a previous familiarity with the individual objects. Page 75 before the child is called upon to group them. If this has been attended to, the grouping of these into any combination will be easy and pleasant. But if his attention be called from the group to examine exclusively even but one of its elements, the operation is checked, the mind becomes confused, its powers are weakened, and the grouping has again to commence under serious disadvantages. To illustrate this point, let us suppose a child introduced to the bustle and sports of a common fair. Here he sees thousands both of familiar and strange objects, all of which are calculated to excite his mind to increased attention, and yet the child, while greatly amused, is still perfectly at his ease. There is not the slightest indication of his being incommoded by the numerous objects about him. No confusion of ideas, no distraction of mind, no mental distress of any kind. But, on the contrary, in the midst of so much to see and to learn, the young looker-on is not only at his ease, but appears to be delighted. The reason of this is, that he is not by any external force compelled to attend to all that he sees, and nature within directs him to attend to no more than he is able to group, or reiterate in his thoughts. We shall endeavor to examine this condition of the child's mind in such circumstances a little more particularly. The child in the circumstances supposed must either be a spectator in general or an examiner in particular. In other words, he must either employ himself with the principle of combination or grouping, or with the principle of individuation, but he never attempts to employ himself with both at the same time. If he amuses himself as an observer in general, he is engaged in grouping objects which are already familiar to him. But while he is so engaged, he never directs his attention to any one unknown object for the purpose of examining it for the first time by itself. He passes over all the minute and unknown objects with a glance, and attends only to page 76, the grouping or associating of those which are already familiar. Nature induces him, while thus employed, to pass by all these minute and unknown objects, because, if he were to do otherwise, his observation in general would instantly be recalled, and his whole attention would be monopolized by the object which he had resolved to examine, to the exclusion of every other for the time. This, however, is not what he seeks, and he employs himself entirely in the grouping of things which are already known. His mind is left at ease, and in the possession of all its powers. He looks only at those things which please him, and he passes over all the others without effort or difficulty. But if the boy shall come to something strange and new, which he is desirous of studying more closely, he immediately becomes an examiner in particular. But, at the same moment, he ceases to be an observer in general. The extended business of the fair, and the several groupings of which it is composed, are lost sight of for the moment. The principle of individuation begins to act, and the operation of the principle of association or grouping is at the same moment brought to a stand. The two are incompatible and cannot act together, and therefore nature never allows the one to interfere with the other. To shew the evil effects of overlooking this important law of nature in the education of a child, we have only to attend to the painful results which would be the consequence of acting contrary to it, even in the vigorous mind of an adult. Let us for this purpose suppose a person of a powerful understanding, and a capacious mind, ushered for the first time, and for only 5 minutes into a crowded apartment in some Eastern caravansary, or Eastern bazaar, in which everything to him was new and strange. And let us also suppose that it was imperatively demanded of him, that he should, in that short space of time, make himself acquainted with all that was, page 77 going on, and be able, on his retiring, minutely to describe all that he saw. The first moment he entered, and the first strange object that caught his eye, would convince him that the thing was impossible. If, without such a demand, he had been introduced into such a place, and had seen various groups of strange persons differently employed, each engaged in a manner altogether new to him, and the nature of which was wholly unknown, he might look on with perfect composure and considerable amusement, because he could attend, like the boy in the fair, either to the general mass, to isolated groups, or to individual things. He would in that case attend to no more than he was able to understand, and would placidly allow the other parts of the scene to pass without any particular attention. But the imperative injunction here supposed, this pressure from without, this artificial and unnatural demand upon him, entirely alters the case. If he even attempted to make himself master of all the particulars of the scene in a circumscribed portion of time, he would find himself bewildered and confounded. The very attempt to individualize and to group so many various objects at the same moment, within such a limited period, would be enough to prostrate all the powers of his mind. He might perhaps be able to observe the persons and their costume, because varieties of persons and dresses are daily and constantly objects of observation, and are grouped without difficulty. But of their several employments, of which he was previously ignorant, he could know nothing, and on retiring, he would neither be able to remember nor to describe them. In such an experiment it would be found that the more anxious he was to perfect his task and to answer the demand, in the same proportion would he find himself harassed and distressed, and the powers of his mind overstretched and weakened. And if this would be the result of confounding the principles of individuation and page 78 grouping in an adult, a person of good understanding and of vigorous mind, how much more hurtful must such a task be, when demanded from children or youths of ordinary capacity, during their attendance at school. Few, we believe, will doubt the general accuracy of the above results in the cases supposed. But some may perhaps question whether they really do arise from the interference of these two antagonist principles during the experiment. To shew that this is the real cause of the distress felt, and the weakness and prostration of mind produced during it, we have only to institute another experiment which is exactly parallel. Let us suppose the same person, and for the same limited period, ushered into the traveler's room in a well-frequented hotel, and let us also suppose that the very same demand is made imperative, that he shall observe and again detail when he retires all that he sees. Let us also suppose that the number of persons here is equally great, and that their employments are all equally diversified, but that each is familiar to him, and we will at once see that the difficulty of the task is really as nothing. A child could accomplish it. His eye would be able to group the whole in an instant without effort and without fatigue. If he saw one party at supper, another at tea, another group at cards, and others amusing themselves at draughts and backgammon, 1 minute instead of 5 would be quite enough to make him master of the whole. On retiring, he would be able to tell the employment of every group in the room, and if any of his acquaintances had made part of the number, he would be able to tell who they were, where they were sitting, and how they were occupied. In doing all this he would find no difficulty, and yet the knowledge he has received is entirely new, and so extensive, that it would take at least 10-fold more time to rehearse it than it took to acquire it. The entire scene also would be permanently imprinted by page 79, the imagination upon the memory, and the whole, or any part of it, could be recalled and reviewed and rehearsed at any future period. Here then are two cases precisely similar in their nature, and undertaken by the very same person, where the results are widely different. And we now see that the difference arises entirely from the principle of individuation having prepared the way in the one case, while it was not allowed to operate in the other. From these circumstances taken together, we perceive that the grouping of objects, when once they are individually familiar, is never a difficult task, but is rather one of gratification and pleasure. And we also are taught that the amount of knowledge thus pleasantly communicated to a child may be most extensive and valuable, while the materials necessary for the purpose, being comparatively few, may be previously rendered familiar with very little exertion. It is the confounding of these two principles in the communication of knowledge that makes learning appear so forbidding to the young, and prevents that cultivation of the mental powers by their exercises which these would otherwise infallibly produce. By keeping each in its proper place, a child will soon acquire a thorough knowledge of the few elements necessary for the purpose, and these, when acquired, may be grouped by the teacher into thousands of forms, for extending the knowledge, and for invigorating the mind of his delighted pupil. The benevolence and wisdom of this beautiful arrangement in the educational process of nature are truly wonderful, and in proportion as it is so, every deviation from it on our parts will be attended with disappointment and evil. If all our ideas were to be acquired and retained by the principle of individuation alone, the memory being without help or resting place would soon become so overpowered by their number that our knowledge would be greatly circumscribed and its use impeded. Of the benefits, page 80, arising from attention to the principle, we have many apt illustrations in ordinary life, among which the various groupings of the 10 numeral figures into sums of any amount, and the forming of so many thousands of words by a different arrangement of the letters of the alphabet, are familiar examples. When a child knows the 10 numerals, he requires no more teaching to ascertain the precise amount of any one number among all the millions which these figures can represent. The value of such an acquirement can only be appreciated by considering the labor it would cost a child to gain a knowledge of all these sums individually, and the overwhelming burden laid upon his memory if each of the millions of sums had to be remembered by a separate character. By the knowledge and various groupings of only 10 such characters, the whole of this mighty burden is removed. In the art of writing, the same principle is brought into operation with complete success, by the combination, or various groupings of the 26 letters of the common Roman alphabet in the formation of words. The value of this adaptation of the principle will be obvious, if we shall suppose that a person who is acquainted with all the modern European languages had been compelled to discriminate and continue to remember a distinct arbitrary mark or character for the many thousands of words contained in each. We may not be warranted, perhaps, to say that such a task would be impossible, but that it would be inconceivably burdensome can admit of no doubt. We have, indeed, in the writings of the Chinese, although it is but one language, a living monument of the evil effects of the neglect of this principle in literature, and the unceasing inconveniences which daily arise from that empire continuing to persevere in it. There is comparatively but little combination of characters in their words, and the consequences are remarkable. In that extensive empire, the highest rewards, page 81, and the chief posts of honor and emolument are held out to those who are most learned, whatever be their rank or their station. And yet, amidst a population immersed in poverty and wretchedness, not one person in 1,000 can master even one of their books, and not one in 10,000 of those who profess to read is able to peruse them all. The reason of this simply is the neglect of this natural principle of grouping letters, or the signs of sounds, in their written language. With us, the elements of all the words in all the European languages are only 26, and the child who has once mastered the combination of these, in any one of our books, has the whole of our literature at his command. The application of this principle to the elements of general knowledge is equally necessary, as its application to written language. The difficulty of remembering the many thousands of unconnected characters in Chinese literature is an exact emblem of what will always be the case with children in respect to their general knowledge, when this principle of association or grouping is neglected. Adults acquire and retain a large portion of their knowledge, as we shall afterwards see, by the principle of classification and analysis. But children are not as yet capable of this, and they must receive their knowledge by the grouping of a few simple elements previously known, or they will not be able to receive and retain knowledge at all. The amount of this knowledge also, it should be kept in mind, is not at all in proportion to the number or the variety of the elements of which that knowledge is composed. We have formerly alluded to this, and it may be farther illustrated by a circumstance of daily occurrence. A seaman, when he observes a vessel at a distance, knows her class and character in an instant, whether she be a sloop or a brig, a schooner or a ship, and he forms an instantaneous idea of all her parts grouped into a whole. His memory, instead of being harassed in page 82 remembering the shape and place and position of each of its several parts, is relieved of the whole by the operation of this principle of association. The whole rigging, about which his mind is occupied, is composed of only 3 elements: ropes and spars and sails, with each of which he has long ago made himself familiar. All the remaining parts of this kind of knowledge are a mere matter of grouping. By previously observing the varied arrangement of the spars and ropes and sails on the several masts of the different kinds of vessels, he has already grouped them into one whole, and each is remembered by itself without effort and without mistake. They are retained, as it were, painted by the imagination upon the memory, and may at any after period be recalled and reviewed at pleasure. Hence, the sight of a vessel in the distance calls up the former pictures to the mind, and enables the practiced eye of the mariner to decide at once as to the kind and character of what he so imperfectly seized. This helps also to explain the reason why children are so gratified with pictures when presented to the eye, and why they are best pleased when the figures are most simple and distinct, and particularly, when the objects grouped in the picture have previously been familiar. Pictures are indeed a pretty close imitation of nature in this part of her work, and they are defective chiefly on account of their want of motion and continuity. These last are two great and inimitable characteristics in all the groupings painted upon the memory by the imagination. From all this it is obvious that there is an essential difference between a child's acquiring the knowledge of things individually and acquiring a knowledge of their several associations. The two must never, if possible, be confounded with each other. When they are kept distinct in the education of a child, he has an evident pleasure in attending to either, but as soon as they are allowed to interfere, and more page 83, especially when they are systematically blended together in the same exercise, he experiences confusion, irritation, and fatigue. There is no necessity, however, for this ever being the case. All that is required is that the few individual elements that are to be grouped or associated in a lesson, whether they be objects or ideas, shall previously be made familiar to the pupil. These, when once known, may be brought before the mind of the child in any variety of order or form, and will be received readily and pleasantly, and will be retained by the memory without confusion, and without effort. By attention to these two principles, keeping each in its proper place, and bringing each to aid and uphold the other in its proper order, it will be found that a child may be taught more real knowledge in 1 week than is often communicated in other circumstances in the course of a year.